Eleanor Whitaker was 54 years old the night her husband carried the last box out of the house she had scrubbed for 26 years, and he did not even look at her when he said it. "Everything you get, Nell, is that old drive-in nobody wants." Rain fell soft and gray on the driveway in Millbrook, Ohio, and Nell stood there in her housecoat, hands shaking, watching the taillights of the truck she had co-signed for pull away toward a woman half her age. 26 years of Sunday suppers, 26 years of ironed shirts, 26 years of being the last one to eat at her own table. And this was what it came down to: a suitcase, a set of rusted keys, and a condemned old movie screen rotting behind a chain-link fence 3 miles out of town, at the edge of a life she no longer recognized as her own. If you have ever given everything you had to someone who decided, one gray morning, that you were simply used up, this story is for you. Because Nell did not know it yet, standing in that driveway with the rain soaking through her collar, but somewhere behind a locked door in that dying drive-in's projection booth, a secret had been waiting for her, sealed away for over 40 years by a man who loved her enough to protect it in silence. Nobody in Millbrook knew what that booth held, not Gary, not his new wife, not even Nell herself, not yet, and nobody could have guessed how soon that would change. Subscribe right now before you go 1 second further, because before this story ends, the people who called Eleanor Whitaker finished, the people who laughed at a woman left with nothing but rust and weeds, are going to watch her become the richest woman in 3 counties, and what was locked inside that booth is the reason why. Stay, because what happens next will prove, once and for all, that the things thrown away are sometimes the very things worth everything, and that justice, when it finally comes all at once, loud enough for the whole town to hear. Nell married Gary Whitaker in the spring of the year she turned 28, in a small ceremony at St. Bartholomew's Church in Millbrook, Ohio, with 14 guests and a cake her own mother baked because there was no money for a bakery order. She wore her sister's old dress, taken in at the waist, and she remembered thinking, walking down that short aisle, that she would spend the rest of her life making sure this man never had to worry about a single thing. For 26 years after that, she became the architecture that held the Whitaker household together, the one who woke first and slept last, the one who remembered every birthday, every dentist appointment, every school play, while Gary built his practice on Main Street from a single rented chair into a business worth, by the end, nearly $900,000. She worked double shifts at the Millbrook Diner for $11 an hour, on her feet from 6 in the morning until her ankles swelled, folding the tips into an envelope marked groceries, never once asking why his growing income never seemed to reach her side of the ledger. She kept the books for his practice on weekends for free, balanced the checkbook every Sunday night at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, and told herself devotion was its own reward. For 26 years she believed it. The way a woman believes something she has repeated to herself so many times, it stops sounding like a question. She raised Danny and Sarah with the same quiet ferocity she brought to everything, packing lunches at 5 in the morning, sitting through every Little League game in a lawn chair that folded wrong, sewing costumes for school plays out of fabric remnants because new fabric cost more than she was willing to spend on herself. She learned to stretch a pot roast across 3 dinners, to patch the knees of jeans instead of buying new ones, to say everything is fine whenever anyone asked, because a mother who admitted otherwise felt to her like a mother who had failed. Danny was 30 now, an accountant in Columbus, 2 hours away, closer than he ever visited. Sarah was 26, married, living 2 towns over, busy in the particular way young mothers are busy, which Nell understood and forgave without being asked to, the same way she had forgiven so many things nobody had ever asked her to forgive. Neither child had called their mother in 3 weeks, and neither had noticed the silence the way Nell noticed it, sitting by the phone some evenings out of habit more than hope, The ringer turned all the way up, just in case. Nell noticed everything. She noticed the small debts of attention that piled up around her like unpaid bills. She simply never said so out loud, because saying so out loud had never once, in 26 years, changed a single thing in that house. When Gary's mother, Dorothy, was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer, it was Nell who drove her to chemotherapy every Tuesday morning for 104 straight weeks, 2 full years, while Gary stayed behind to see patients because someone had to keep the practice running. Nell held the basin when Dorothy was sick. Nell learned to change the dressing on the port in her chest, learned the names of 6 different medications, and when each one had to be taken, learned to sit through silence in a hospital chair without once checking the clock. Nell sat in waiting rooms memorizing the pattern of the carpet, while machines beeped somewhere behind a door she was not allowed through, drinking bad coffee from a paper cup, telling herself this too was devotion, this too was love, this too would matter to somebody eventually. When Dorothy finally passed on a rainy October morning, Gary wept at the funeral, and 3 relatives told Nell what a wonderful daughter-in-law she had been, patting her hand like she was furniture that had performed its function well. Not one of them asked how she was holding up, because nobody in that family had ever once, in 26 years, thought to ask Nell how she was holding up, not at the hospital, not at the funeral, and not in the quiet weeks after, when she kept setting Dorothy's coffee cup out of habit before catching herself and putting it away. She swallowed the small cruelties the way she swallowed everything else, quietly, without complaint, filing them away in a place she never let herself examine too closely. The forgotten anniversary in year 19, when Gary came home late smelling of somebody else's perfume and called it a client dinner. The comment at church fellowship from a woman named Carol Ashby that Nell was lucky Gary had stayed with someone so plain for so long, said with a smile that was meant to look like kindness. The way Gary's eyes moved past her at dinner parties, toward younger women, toward louder women, toward anyone who was not the tired wife who had given him everything she had to give. Humiliation, Nell came to understand, does not arrive all at once. It arrives in small doses, a comment here, a silence there, a birthday forgotten, over decades, until a woman forgets what it felt like to be seen, to be chosen, to be anything other than useful. She swallowed grief, she swallowed anger, she swallowed the loneliness of sleeping beside a man who had stopped truly looking at her sometime around year 15, and she called all of that swallowing patience, because patience was a word she could live inside without falling apart, a word softer and safer than the word she really meant, which was grief. The first omen came earlier than she ever understood its meaning. Her great-uncle Walter Briggs, who had run the Starlight Drive-In on the edge of Millbrook until it closed its gates in 1998, used to write her letters twice a year, in careful, slanted handwriting, always ending the same way. "There is one reel in that booth I will never sell, not for any price in this world, and someday, Nellie, you will understand why I kept it." He signed every letter the same way too, "Your uncle, who has not forgotten you," which struck her as an odd thing to write until years later, when it did not seem odd at all. Nobody in the family took the old man seriously. Gary called him a hoarder who lived alone with his junk and his old films. Danny and Sarah barely remembered him at all, having met him only twice, at holidays, when they were small. Only Nell wrote back, every single time, in her own careful hand, because some quiet part of her had always believed Walter meant exactly what he said, word for word, letter for letter. She kept every one of those letters in a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet, 42 of them by the time he died, tied together with a length of kitchen twine, and some nights, after a bad day, she would take them down and read them again, not for the words exactly, but for the feeling underneath them, the feeling of being remembered by someone who had never once asked her for a single thing in return, not her time, not her money, not her devotion. Walter died last spring, alone in the small house behind the drive-in, at the age of 83. And when the will was read in a cramped office above the county courthouse, the attorney announced that Eleanor Whitaker was named sole heir to the Starlight Drive-In property, condemned since 2010, $14,000 owed in back taxes, structure listed as unsafe for public occupancy. Gary laughed out loud in that office, a short, ugly bark of a laugh. So did his sister. So did the clerk taking notes, quietly, behind her hand, as if the whole thing were a joke everyone but Nell had been let in on. Nell did not laugh. She sat very still in a hard wooden chair, remembering 40 years of letters, remembering a promise repeated so many times it had worn a groove into her memory, the way water wears a groove into stone, and she found herself wondering, with a small, cold feeling she could not name, why a man who owned almost nothing would insist, again and again, in ink across 4 decades, that a condemned old movie screen was worth more than the whole town of Millbrook combined. Gary did not wait for the paperwork to finish before he was already telling people at the diner, at the barber shop, at the dental practice he had built on her unpaid labor, that his soon-to-be ex-wife had finally gotten exactly what she deserved, a pile of rust nobody in their right mind would ever want. The divorce papers arrived by courier on a Tuesday morning in March, while Nell stood at the ironing board pressing Gary's shirts out of a habit 26 years deep, a habit she had not yet found a way to stop, even though he no longer slept in the house. She signed for the envelope with a shaking hand, and the courier would not meet her eyes, because everyone in Millbrook, it seemed, already knew what was inside before she did. Gary had filed the paperwork the same week he moved Chelsea Doyle into a rental house on Larkspur Lane, 3 streets over from the home Nell had scrubbed for a quarter of a century, 3 streets close enough that Nell sometimes drove past it without meaning to, just to see the lights on in windows that used to be dark by 9. He did not come himself to deliver the news. He sent papers instead of words, the same cowardly way he had been sending silence instead of love for years. And Nell understood, standing there with the iron still hissing steam into the shirt on the board, still pressing a collar for a man who had already left her twice over, that this was simply the final version of a message he had been delivering to her for a very long time. At a family dinner 2 weeks later, one Gary insisted on hosting at the house that was still, legally, half hers, he made the announcement in front of Danny and Sarah as though he were reading a weather report off a card. Nell would keep the drive-in, he said, setting down his fork first, and nothing else, because a woman who had never amounted to much in 26 years probably belonged with something that had never amounted to much either. Chelsea, seated where Nell used to sit, laughed softly into her wineglass, a laugh she did not bother to hide. Danny stared at his plate and said nothing. Sarah, 26 years old and married now herself, with a mother-in-law of her own she was learning to love, said nothing at all either, and it was that nothing, more than anything Gary said, more than Chelsea's laugh, more than the whole ugly performance of it, that Nell would carry with her for the rest of her life. Shame. That was the only word for what moved through her chest that night. Hot and total. The particular shame of being humiliated by your own husband in front of your own grown children while they said nothing at all to defend you. Grief sat right beside it, close enough to touch, because grief and shame, Nell was learning at 54 years old, often arrive together, dressed as the same feeling, impossible to separate once they take hold of a person in a dining room she used to call her own. She drove home that night with both hands tight on the wheel, replaying the silence at that table over and over, wondering which was worse, the cruelty of the man who had said it, or the silence of the children who had let it stand without a word in her defense, without so much as a glance in her direction. 3 days after that dinner, Nell came home early from her shift at the Millbrook diner and heard Chelsea's voice through the half-open kitchen window before she ever saw her, laughing into the phone with her father, developer Frank Doyle, the man behind half the strip malls and half the quiet land deals in 3 counties. The old Whitaker wife got stuck with a condemned dump out on Route 9, Chelsea said, while we get the house and the money and the whole rest of the life she used to have. And honestly, Dad, it's almost funny how little she turned out to be worth. Frank laughed back through the phone, loud enough that Nell heard every word of it too, standing frozen on her own back step, holding a bag of groceries she had bought that morning with the last of her diner tips, counted out in dollar bills at the register, while the cashier waited, patient but pointed, the way people in that town had started being patient and pointed with her lately. She did not move for a long moment. She simply stood there in her own driveway, in the fading light, listening to 2 people she had never once wronged discuss her like she was a line item already closed out, already filed away, already forgotten, worth nothing more than a punchline between a father and his daughter. Indignation rose in her then, quiet and slow, not the kind that shouts or breaks dishes, but the kind that settles low into the spine and simply stays there, waiting for a place to go. She set the groceries down on the step, carefully, the way she did everything, and let herself feel, just once, exactly how small they had wanted her to feel, before she made herself stand up straight and carry the bag inside. At the bank the following week, a teller named Patty, who had poured Nell's deposits across that same counter for 15 years, slid a printed statement toward her with an apologetic wince that said more than her mouth ever could. The joint account, the one that had held $92,000 in savings the month before, the money Nell had squirreled away from tips and coupons and 100 small denials over 2 decades, now held $412, drained by Gary through a series of transfers made in the 7 days before he filed. Patty did not say anything cruel. She did not have to say a single word. The number printed on that page said everything Nell needed to hear about what 26 years of shared life had actually been worth to the man who lived it beside her. Nell folded the statement in half, then in half again, and slid it into her purse the way a person slides away something too heavy to look at twice, and thanked Patty, out of habit, for the trouble. At the county courthouse, finalizing the estate paperwork on Walter's property, a clerk slid Nell a tax bill for $14,000 in back taxes owed on the Starlight Drive-In, unpaid since the year it closed, and Gary's divorce attorney, seated 2 chairs down waiting on an unrelated filing, smirked without even bothering to look up from his phone. $14,000 she did not have, owed on a property everyone in town had already decided was worthless, stacked on top of everything else she had already lost that spring, on top of the house, the savings, the marriage, the 26 years, on top of a Tuesday that had already asked more of her than she had left to give. The unfairness of it landed in her stomach like a stone dropped into still water, sinking slow, spreading rings she could feel for hours afterward, all the way home, all the way into the small rented room that had become her whole life, all the way into a night of sleep that never quite arrived. The locksmith came to rekey the house on a Thursday morning, while Nell's few remaining boxes still sat out on the porch where Gary had left them the day before, uncovered in a light rain that had soaked through the cardboard by morning. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, the way people in small towns always watch, careful never to be caught looking, curious in a way that never quite crossed the line into kindness. Nobody came outside to help her carry a single box, though she had brought casseroles to half of those same houses over 26 years of illness and loss and new babies, though she had sat with more than one of those neighbors in a hospital hallway holding a hand nobody remembered, now belonged to her. She carried the last box herself, in the rain, and did not let herself look back at the curtains twitching in the front windows all down the street. At the diner the following Saturday, working what would be one of her last shifts there, she overheard 2 women in a booth near the register, women she had poured coffee for every week for a decade, discussing her situation in voices that were not quite as low as they believed. "Poor Nell," one of them said. 26 years, and she comes out of it with a condemned drive-in and a rusted key. Can you even imagine building a whole life and ending up with that?" The other one laughed, not unkindly exactly, but laughed all the same, and Nell kept pouring coffee with a hand that did not shake, because 26 years of practice had taught her exactly how to keep her hand steady in front of people who pitied her without once actually seeing her. That night, alone in the small rented room above the hardware store that was all she could afford on a diner paycheck and $412, with the smell of paint thinner drifting up through the floorboards and a single bare bulb swinging overhead, Nell allowed herself, for the first time in months, to name everything she felt out loud, to the empty room, to nobody at all. Humiliation, grief, fury, real fury, the kind she had never once permitted herself to feel across 26 years of marriage, rising now with nowhere left to go and no one left in the world to hide it from. She sat on the edge of a narrow bed that was not hers, and she let herself cry the way she had not let herself cry at the funeral, or the will reading, or the dinner table, all of it finally arriving at once. By the end of that week, she had exactly what remained to her name after 26 years of devotion: a single suitcase, a set of rusted keys on a ring gone orange with age, and a condemned piece of property 3 miles outside a town that had already decided, unanimously, what all of it was worth. Everyone she had ever loved had already told her, in one way or another, over 1 week or over 26 years, that it was nothing, that she was nothing, and that both of those things were finally, officially, on paper, true. She stood at the window of the little rented room and looked down at Main Street, at the diner, at the bank, at the courthouse, all the places that had just spent a month telling her exactly what she was worth, and she found she could not make herself believe a single one of them. Not the diner, not the bank, not the courthouse, not one voice among all of them that had ever once bothered to ask her what she actually believed herself to be worth. She packed the suitcase anyway. She had nothing left to protect, and nothing left to lose, and something in her, some small stubborn ember that 26 years of small cruelties had never quite managed to put out, told her plainly that a man does not write 42 letters about a single reel of film for no reason at all. Not if that man was Walter Briggs, and not if that man had spent his whole quiet life keeping promises nobody else in the family had ever bothered to keep, letter after letter, year after year, decade after decade. So Nell got into her old Honda Civic, the one with 190,000 miles on it, put the ring of rusted keys on the passenger seat beside her, and drove toward Millbrook's Edge to see the Starlight Drive-In with her own 2 eyes before anyone else in this world could tell her, one more time, what it was, or was not, worth to a woman who had already lost everything else worth losing. Nell drove 2 hours down Route 9 in her 15-year-old Honda Civic, past cornfields going gold at the edges, past a faded billboard advertising a bank that had closed a decade earlier, until she reached a sign leaning slightly to one side that still read, in peeling paint, Starlight Drive-In, established 1962. She had passed that sign 100 times as a girl, riding in the back of her uncle's truck on hot summer nights, sticky with root beer and half asleep before the first picture even started, and she had never once imagined she would be the one driving toward it alone, at 54, with a suitcase in the trunk and a marriage behind her that had lasted longer than the theater's best years ever had. The radio played something soft and forgettable, and she let it play, both hands on the wheel, watching the fields blur by, rehearsing what she would say when she finally stood in front of the gate. She promised herself, out loud, in the quiet of the car, that whatever waited behind it, she would survive it, the way she had survived every other loss that had been handed to her without her permission, and the way she intended to survive every loss still to come, whatever shape it decided to take this time. At the rusted gate, a man was waiting for her, though she had told no one at all that she was coming. He was 71 years old, tall once, and stooped now, wearing a cap faded to no particular color and a jacket patched at both elbows, and he introduced himself as Earl Dolan, the man who had run the projector for Walter Briggs for 30 straight years, the man who still drove out to check on the place every single week, rain or shine, long after anyone had asked him to, long after there was any reason left to. Earl's eyes went wet the moment he saw her step out of the car, and his voice, when it finally came, was rougher than he meant it to be, cracking in a way that surprised them both. "Your uncle knew this day would come, Eleanor," he said, "and he made me promise, more than once, that I would be here waiting when it finally did, however long it took, even if it took years, even if it took the rest of his own life to see it through." And Earl, it turned out, had meant every word of that promise. Nell looked past him, toward the screen tower rising up out of the weeds, 62 years old and rusted through in places, and something about it struck her as wrong in a way she could not immediately name. It was not falling down. It was standing, stubborn, upright, far sturdier than the condemned notice nailed to the fence post had led her to believe, sturdier than 3 counties of gossip had ever given it credit for being, sturdier, in some strange way, than she had felt in months. Weeds choked the old ticket booth, and vines had swallowed half the snack bar sign, but the structure itself, the bones of the place, felt more solid under her gaze than the house she had just been forced out of, more solid than the marriage that had just ended, more solid than anything she had been told to believe in for a very long time. She walked the gravel lot slowly, running her hand along the rusted speaker poles as she passed, feeling, for the first time in weeks, something close to curiosity instead of grief, an unfamiliar lightness settling somewhere behind her ribs that she did not yet trust enough to name. Earl led her past the rows of collapsed speaker poles, past the rusted swing set nobody had used since the 70s, toward a squat concrete building at the back of the lot, and stopped in front of a door that was bolted with a lock far newer and far heavier than anything else on the property. A lock that did not belong to 1962 or to 1998. A lock that had clearly been added since, and maintained since, oiled and cared for, the way nothing else on the property had been. Earl reached into his coat pocket and produced a second key, one that matched the ring already trembling in Nell's hand, and he held it out to her without quite letting go of it yet, as if some part of him needed one more second before he handed over whatever came next. "Once we open this door, Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping low and steady, "there is no closing it again, not for you, not for anyone, not ever again." Behind him, the old projection booth waited in silence, holding whatever it had been holding, patiently, faithfully, for 40 long years. The door creaked open onto 4 decades of undisturbed dust, and the smell that rushed out to meet them was old film stock and machine oil, and something faintly sweet underneath, like the ghost of popcorn butter that had soaked into the concrete so many summers ago it had never quite left. Earl stepped in first, running a hand along the wall for a light switch that still impossibly worked, and in the sudden yellow glow, he turned to Nell with an expression she had not seen aimed at her in longer than she could remember, something like pride, something like relief. "Your uncle always said you were the only Whittaker with any spine at all," Earl told her, his voice catching on the word spine as though he had waited 30 years to finally be allowed to say it out loud. Nell, standing in a doorway that had been sealed since before her own children were born, found she did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all, and simply stepped inside, her shoes stirring up dust that had not moved since Bill Clinton was president, and her own marriage was still young enough to feel like a promise instead of a sentence. The old projector still stood at the center of the room, a great steel machine gone dull with age, but not with neglect. Every gear wiped clean, every reel arm oiled, as though Walter had come in and tended it faithfully every single week of his life, even after the theater stopped running pictures for anyone but himself. Film canisters lined a shelf along the back wall in perfect, dustless rows, each one labeled in Walter's careful slanted hand. Ordinary titles, pictures that had played the starlight in its best years. And Nell moved down the row slowly, reading names of movies she had never heard of, feeling the particular quiet that comes from standing inside someone else's devotion, a devotion that had outlasted his own health, his own money, and very nearly his own life. Earl watched her read the labels and said quietly that Walter used to come out here alone, some nights, and run a picture for no one at all, just to hear the projector hum the way it used to when the lot was full of cars. It was Earl who noticed it first, running his palm flat along the wall behind the film cabinet, frowning at something only his fingers could detect after 30 years of knowing every inch of that small room by heart. "The seam," he said, tapping twice, sharp little raps that echoed oddly, "is too clean." This wall was not poured in 1962 like the rest of the building, he told her. It was built later, built carefully, built to match the old concrete so well that nobody who did not already know exactly where to look would ever have thought to look at all. Not a contractor, not a county inspector, not even the men who had come years back to condemn the place. Nell felt something tighten low in her chest, the particular tightening that comes right before a question a person has carried for years is finally, actually, about to be answered, the kind of tightening that feels almost exactly like hope, trying to remember how to exist again. Together they worked a loose section of paneling free, prying gently at first, and then harder, Earl's hands trembling now nearly as much as Nell's, until a narrow steel door revealed itself behind the false wall, set flush into the concrete, cold under Nell's palm when she finally reached out and touched it. It was a safe, compact and heavy, the kind built to survive a fire or a flood or a lifetime of being forgotten, and stamped into its face in small block letters were two initials, W.B. Walter Briggs, the man who had spent 40 years insisting, in letter after letter, that a single reel of film was worth more than an entire town, and who had never once, in all that time, given anyone a single reason to believe him. Earl stepped back from it slowly, as if the safe itself had suddenly become sacred ground, and told Nell it was hers to open, not his, that Walter had made that much perfectly clear. There was no combination written anywhere Earl knew of, and for a long, breathless moment, they simply stood in front of it, two people staring at a locked door neither of them could open, until Nell remembered, suddenly, one line repeated in letter after letter across 4 decades, a line she had always assumed was nothing more than an old man's sentiment. "Some things are worth keeping exactly as they were the day they mattered most," Walter had written to her, every single year, in every single letter, and Nell, her hands shaking so badly she had to try twice, turned the dial to the date of her own wedding day, the spring she turned 28, the day Walter himself had walked her partway down the aisle because her own father had passed the year before, and there had been no one else left to do it. The tumblers clicked, one after another, and the door swung open on a hinge that had clearly been oiled far more recently than anything else in the room, as if Walter had come back, again and again, across the years, simply to make sure that when this moment finally arrived, nothing would stand in the way of it. Inside sat 3 reels of film, each one labeled by hand, The Lonesome Highway, 1957, a title Nell had never once heard spoken in her entire life, not once, not by Walter, not by anyone. Beside the reels lay a thick leather folder, cracked with age at every corner, and a sealed envelope with her name written across the front in Walter's unmistakable slanted hand, Eleanor, and only Eleanor. No one else's name anywhere on the safe, on the folder, or on the envelope at all, as if Walter had spent 4 decades making absolutely certain there could be no confusion, none at all, about who all of this had always belonged to. Earl backed away and let her kneel there alone in front of it, understanding, without being told, that whatever came next was not his to witness up close. 30 years of loyalty finally giving way, gracefully, to the one person it had always actually belonged to. Her fingers shook as she broke the seal. Walter's letter explained, in his same careful slanted script, that he had bought the failing Starlight in 1961 with every dollar he owned in this world, and had learned, only after signing the papers, that a Hollywood studio and a hungry land buyer had once conspired together to steal both the film and the ground it was stored on from the man who had made it. A young director run out of the business and nearly out of his own life over a single unreleased picture nobody in power had wanted seen. Walter had hidden the reels rather than let greed win twice in one lifetime, and he had waited, year after year, letter after letter, for the one relative in his entire family he trusted not to let greed win a 3rd time either, not with his land and not with his niece. Deeper in the folder lay the property's original 1961 deed, yellowed and brittle at the folds, and it was Earl who caught the number first, reading it twice, then a 3rd time, before he finally said it out loud, his voice unsteady. 42 acres, he said. Not 12, not the number the county had carried in its own records for 60 straight years, but 42, a boundary line drawn wide by a surveyor whose signature neither of them recognized, a line that had simply never been corrected in the county courthouse across 6 decades of paperwork. An error, or perhaps a kindness someone had quietly protected. Nobody left alive could say for certain which, and neither Nell nor Earl was in any hurry to decide. By the next morning, word had reached Desmond Cole, an estate attorney 2 towns over who had handled Walter's affairs for the better part of 2 decades, and he arrived at the Starlight with his own set of old county maps rolled under one arm, comparing them line by line against the deed in Nell's trembling hands for the better part of an hour. "This is airtight," Cole told her finally, looking up from the paperwork with something like disbelief of his own, the kind of disbelief that comes from a man who has seen a great many estates and almost never one like this. "This property, all 42 acres of it, sits directly across the corridor the state has already approved for the new Route 9 highway interchange, land that a certain local developer has been quietly trying to assemble, parcel by parcel, deed by deed, for well over a year now, without ever once realizing the single most important parcel of all had already slipped permanently out of his reach." Ruth Callahan arrived 2 days later, a film archivist from the State Historical Society that Cole had personally called. The same afternoon he saw the reels, and she held the first canister up to the light, with hands as careful as a surgeon's, reading the leader stock, checking the edge codes stamped into the film itself, murmuring numbers and dates to herself for nearly 20 minutes, before she finally looked up at Nell with an expression Nell would remember for the rest of her life. "This film was reported destroyed in a studio fire back in 1959, Ruth said quietly, her voice unsteady in a way that made the moment feel larger than either of them had expected. Archives and private collectors have been searching for a single surviving print for well over 60 years, and you, Mrs. Whitaker, are standing here holding 3 of them in a condemned concrete room 3 miles outside a town that never once thought to look." The number, when it finally came, arrived in careful, measured pieces, the way all the very worst and very best news tends to arrive. The reels alone, Ruth estimated after 2 more phone calls to colleagues at a university archive, colleagues who had spent careers chasing rumors of this exact print, could bring $1.8 million from preservation collectors and studios eager to restore a lost piece of film history to something audiences could finally see again. Cole added his own figure a moment later, quieter, almost apologetic about it. The land, once appraised against the new highway corridor, was worth another $3.4 million entirely on its own, separate from the film, separate from anything Walter had hidden in that safe. Nell sat down hard on an overturned crate, her legs simply refusing to hold her upright any longer, because the total, when Cole finally said it aloud, plainly, evenly, the way a man reads a number he still cannot quite believe himself, was $5.2 million, sitting quietly inside a condemned concrete building that the entire town of Millbrook had spent a quarter of a century calling worthless, and that her own husband had called worthless again just 3 weeks earlier, in front of her own children, at her own dinner table, over a meal she had not even been invited to finish. If you have ever been told, by someone who was supposed to know your worth better than anyone, that you amounted to nothing, let this be the moment you remember, because nothing Nell Whitaker had ever been called was about to matter again. But it was the second letter, tucked behind the deed where no one would have thought to look for it, that broke something open in Nell's chest that no number ever could reach. Walter had written it the year Dorothy first got sick, the same year Nell was driving her to chemotherapy every Tuesday morning without a single word of complaint. And in it, he said he had watched, quietly, from a distance, as his niece gave everything she had to people who never once turned around to see her doing it. He had decided, he wrote, that someone in this family was finally going to see her properly, even if he had to wait until after his own death to make sure it happened. "I always saw you, Nellie," the letter said, in handwriting that had gone shakier near the end. "I saw you the whole time, every single year, and I was never, not once, going to let them tell you that you were nothing." Nell was still holding that letter, tears finally falling freely for the first time in months, unashamed, uncontrolled, decades overdue, when the sound of tires on gravel reached them from outside, an engine she recognized instantly, a truck she had ridden in for 26 years, pulling to a hard, sudden stop at the edge of the lot. Someone in Millbrook had talked, the way someone in Millbrook always eventually talked. Word had already reached Gary Whitaker that his ex-wife was standing inside a building suddenly worth more than everything he had ever owned or ever would own, and he was here now, engine still running, to see it for himself before he had even decided what he intended to do about it. Gary came through the gate the way he did everything now, loudly, sure of himself, certain the world still owed him the last word. Chelsea followed a step behind him, heels sinking into the gravel with every stride, and behind them both, arriving separately in a black pickup with his own company's logo stamped across the door, came Frank Doyle himself. Jaw already set for a fight, he was fully convinced he was going to win. Gary called out, before he had even reached the projection booth, some half-formed joke about Nell finally striking oil in a pile of rust, the same tired cruelty dressed up as humor he had used on her for years, and it died flat in his throat the moment he saw Desmond Cole and Ruth Callahan standing there, folders open, signed appraisals in hand, waiting for him, along with Earl, arms crossed, standing quietly in front of the booth door like a man guarding something worth guarding. Nell did not raise her voice. She had spent 26 years learning exactly how not to raise her voice in that man's presence, and she was not about to start now, on the one single day it had finally stopped mattering whether she did or not. "The drive-in you laughed at," she said, calm, steady, looking him directly in the eye for what felt like the first time in years, "is worth more right now than the house, the practice, and every account you drained combined, Gary. And I did not even have to lift one finger to make that true. It was already true. It had been true the whole time. You just never once thought to ask." Cole stepped forward next, calm and unhurried in the way only a man holding all the paperwork can afford to be, and delivered the piece of news that made Frank Doyle's face change color in real time. right there in front of everyone. Walter Briggs's letter, Cole said, established a protective trust on this property years before his death, a trust specifically written to void any attempted purchase by Doyle Development or by any company connected to it in any way, effective the instant such a purchase was ever attempted. Walter had known, Cole added, exactly who might come looking someday, exactly what shape their greed would take, and had planned for every bit of it accordingly, years in advance, without ever once telling a soul. Frank Doyle went very still, the color rising in his neck, the way it does in men who are not used to losing, and are not sure yet how to stand while it happens to them in public. $200,000, he finally said, mostly to himself, quiet, almost stunned by his own arithmetic. In surveys and engineering reports, and quiet backroom conversations his company had already spent chasing this exact parcel of land. Land it turned out he had never once had a single legal chance of ever owning, not for one single day of all the months his people had spent chasing it, not for one single dollar of the money he had already spent. Every conversation, every handshake, every quiet promise he had made to investors over expensive lunches, built entirely on sand, sand that had just shifted out from underneath him in front of the one audience he could least afford to lose face in front of. Chelsea's face drained of color faster than her father's had, standing there in her sinking heels with nothing clever left to say. She had spent weeks mocking a woman over a piece of land her own family had been secretly circling, like vultures, for the better part of a year, and now that same family stood exposed, in front of witnesses, in front of an attorney and an archivist, and half of Millbrook craning their necks at the gate, as the ones who had tried to quietly buy a condemned old drive-in out from under a grieving old man long before Nell had ever set foot back on the property at all, and who had spent weeks laughing at the very woman whose name, it turned out, had been standing in the way of their whole scheme the entire time without either of them ever knowing it. Word moved through Millbrook fast, the way it always did in a town small enough that everybody's business belonged to everybody else eventually, and within days the historic film discovery had reached the local paper, then the state paper, then a short segment on the evening news out of Columbus. The community that had once laughed Nell out of a cramped courthouse office now lined the road outside the Starlight's gates just to see the place for themselves, cameras and lawn chairs and thermoses of coffee. And Gary and Chelsea, standing near their trucks at the edge of that same gathering crowd, found themselves, for the first time in this entire story, the ones being watched, whispered about, and quietly judged by the very same town that had spent months quietly judging Nell instead. If you have ever waited years for the people who wronged you to finally understand what they threw away, this was that moment, delivered whole, delivered public, delivered exactly the way Nell had never once let herself imagine it could be, not in her most private moments of anger, not in her quietest moments of grief, not even in the wildest version of the daydream she had never quite let herself finish. Justice, when it finally comes, rarely arrives quietly, and it did not arrive quietly here either, not with half of Millbrook standing at the gate to watch it happen. Gary tried one last time, his voice dropping into the softer register he used to use on her, years ago, back before Chelsea, back before all of it went wrong, in ways he had never once bothered to notice. "Nell," he said, "sweetheart, maybe we could talk about this, just the two of us. Maybe there's a way we figure all this out together, the way we used to figure things out." He reached toward her arm the way he used to, easy, familiar, assuming, as he always had for 26 years, that reaching for her was the same thing as being welcomed by her. Nell stepped back, just one step, small and unhurried, and absolutely final. "No," she said, one plain word, and it cost her nothing at all to say it. Not one thing, not after everything 26 years of silence had already cost her to finally be able to say it out loud, in front of everyone, without her voice shaking even once. Gary's hand hung in the air a moment longer, reaching for someone who was no longer there to be reached, and then dropped back to his side, empty, the way it would stay from now on. She turned then and walked back through the gate that was now, legally, entirely, completely hers, past Earl, past Cole, past Callahan, past the crowd gathering at the edge of the road to watch a woman they had underestimated for a quarter of a century finally walk somewhere on her own 2 feet, leaving Gary standing exactly where he had always left her, alone in a driveway, watching someone else walk away for once, with nothing left to say. The humiliation was over. It belonged to someone else now, and Nell did not look back to see how it settled on him. 6 months later, the Starlight Drive-In reopened under a string of new lights and a marquee repainted in the same cheerful red it had worn back in 1962. Its gravel lot full of cars for the first time since 1998, headlights facing a screen that had been patched, primed, and finally brought back to life after 26 years of silence. Nell stood near the concession stand she had built with the first portion of the film archive sale, watching families she had known her entire life in Millbrook pull in one after another, kids pressing their faces to car windows, teenagers laughing in truck beds, old couples settling into lawn chairs they had clearly owned for decades, and she felt something rise in her chest that she had almost forgotten the name of: simple, uncomplicated happiness, earned rather than given, hers rather than borrowed from anyone else's approval of her, hers to keep, finally, without asking anyone's permission first. Somewhere in that crowd, a little girl asked her mother what movie was playing, and the mother said the name of an old picture Nell had chosen herself, one Walter used to run on quiet Friday nights for no one at all. She had used the trust Walter left behind to keep all 42 acres protected permanently, safe from Doyle development and safe from every developer like it that might ever come sniffing around a piece of land worth this much in the years still ahead. A portion of the proceeds from the historic film sale went into scholarships at Millbrook Community College, named quietly for a woman named Dorothy, because some debts of care Nell still wanted to honor even after everything that family had put her through. The rest she poured directly into the Starlight itself, into new speakers, a fully restored snack bar, a ticket booth painted the same shade of yellow Walter had always insisted, in letter after letter, was the only correct color for a drive-in worth its name, and a new sign out front, hand-lettered, that simply read, "The Starlight, under new ownership, same as it always should have been." Millbrook's town council even sent a letter of its own, awkward and a little late, asking whether the Starlight might consider hosting the county's summer festival that year, and Nell said yes before she had even finished reading it twice. Earl ran the projector every single Friday night, exactly as he had promised Walter he would, and exactly as he intended to keep doing for as long as his hands would still let him climb the narrow stairs to the booth. He had a new title for himself now, one Nell had insisted on printing onto a small brass plaque screwed beside the booth door: Head Projectionist, Founding Friend, and he wore the title the way some men wear a medal, quietly, proudly, and only when someone else pointed it out first, never bragging, never once mentioning, unless directly asked, the 30 years he had spent keeping a promise nobody else in this story had ever thought to ask him to keep in the first place, long before there was any fortune at all to make the keeping of it worthwhile, back when it was simply the right thing to do for a friend who had asked him for one small favor. Nell forgave Gary, eventually, though not for his sake, and not out loud, in any dramatic scene either of them would ever describe the same way to anyone else. She forgave him because carrying 26 years of anger around in her chest had started to cost more than she was willing to keep paying, more than it was worth to keep hauling around every single day like an extra suitcase she had never asked to carry. She had learned, finally, at 54 years old, that peace was a thing she was allowed to choose entirely for herself, regardless of whether the person who hurt her had done a single thing to earn it, and regardless of whether he ever fully understood, in whatever years he had left, exactly what he had thrown away in that dining room 3 weeks before, a will was ever read, over a fork he had set down first, before he had ever said a single word. The moral of it settled into her slowly. Over those 6 quiet months, the way truth settles into a person only after the noise around it finally goes still and there is room left to hear it. She had spent decades being exactly who everyone else needed her to be: a wife, a nurse, a mother, a hand to hold in a hospital waiting room, a name on a joint account somebody else emptied without asking, and only now, standing in a gravel lot, she owned outright under her own name. Watching a screen she had personally brought back from the dead, was she finally free to discover who she had always been underneath all of that devotion? All along, patient, capable, and worth far more than anyone around her had ever once bothered to say out loud in 26 years, or in 54. On the last Friday of that 6th month, as the projector clicked on and the first frame of light hit the screen, and a lot full of cars settled in for the picture, Earl came down from the booth holding a small sealed envelope he said had been tucked behind a support beam nobody had ever thought to check in 40 years of climbing those same stairs. It was addressed once again, in Walter's careful slanted hand, to Eleanor, and only Eleanor, as every important thing that man had ever left behind had always been addressed. Nell turned it over once in her hands, feeling the same tightening in her chest she had felt the day the safe finally opened. And she did not open it there, not in front of everyone, choosing instead to carry it quietly inside, into the warm yellow light of the booth, alone, the way she suspected Walter would have wanted her to read it. If you have stayed with Nell Whitaker this far, all the way from a driveway in the rain to a gravel lot full of headlights, thank you, sincerely, from the bottom of our hearts, for witnessing a story about what it truly means to be discarded by the people who should have valued you most, and to rise anyway, on your own terms, in your own time, with nobody's permission required and nobody's approval necessary. Her journey from a condemned marriage and a condemned theater to a fortune nobody in Millbrook ever believed possible is a reminder worth carrying with you long after this story ends and the screen finally goes dark. That being underestimated by the people around you, even for 26 long years, even by the very people who promised to love you, is never, ever the same thing as being finished. Because that is the whole truth sitting underneath everything that happened to Eleanor Whitaker, the truth her own Uncle Walter spent 40 years and 42 careful letters trying to protect for her, quietly, patiently, without ever once asking for a single ounce of credit or thanks in return, without ever once needing her to know his reasons until the exact right moment finally arrived. She spent 26 years being exactly who everyone else needed her to be: a wife, a caretaker, a name on a joint account someone else quietly emptied, and it took a condemned drive-in, a sealed safe, and one man's stubborn, silent devotion to finally show her, and show everyone in Millbrook who ever doubted her, exactly who she had been capable of becoming the entire time, all along, waiting patiently underneath the surface for somebody, anybody, to finally take the time to look closely enough to see it. Tell us, in the comments below, the one single word that describes how this story made you feel while you listened: humiliation, hope, triumph, or something else entirely that only you would know the true name of, something private and personal that this story happened to reach inside you and quietly touch. We read every single comment, every single one of them, always, and we would genuinely love to know which moment landed hardest for you: the driveway in the rain, the safe finally opening after 40 patient years, or Nell walking away from that gate without ever once looking back at the man who used to be her whole world, at 54 years old, with nothing left in this world to prove to him or to anyone. If this story moved you even a little, please share it with someone in your own life who has ever been told, by someone who absolutely should have known better, that they were worth nothing at all, that they had amounted to nothing, that they should simply be grateful for whatever scraps were finally handed to them. Somewhere out there tonight, someone badly needs the reminder that justice has a way of finding its way home, quietly, patiently, on its own schedule, even when it takes decades, or a lifetime, or one locked door behind a dusty old projection booth to finally arrive right on time, exactly when it was always meant to, and not one single day before. This is who we are, and this is what we believe, all the way down to the bone, that the things people throw away only prove, in the end, exactly what those people never deserved to keep in the first place. And that quiet devotion, however long it goes unnoticed, however many years it is forced to wait, is never, ever truly wasted. Until the next story finds you, take care of yourselves, and take care of each other, the way Nell Whitaker always did, for 26 long years, even when nobody around her was paying enough attention to notice, or to care, or to say thank you. Because somebody, somewhere, is always watching more closely than you think, even if it takes 40 years, 42 letters, and one sealed safe behind a projection booth for you to finally, fully find out.